On this video we'll continue with the commentary to the Mishnah, and we're up to the third Mishnah in Megillah, in the third Perek in the Mishnayot, or fourth Perek in the Gemara. So, as I mentioned before, this is going to continue on the same similar subject to what the previous Mishnayot were dealing with, and that is the Kiddushat Bet Hakneset, the holiness of the synagogue. And he just mentions that Rabbi Yehuda says, in this case nobody argues with it, it's or at least the halacha follows this, and that is that even if a synagogue is destroyed, chas v'shalom, it still has holiness. The place of the former synagogue has holiness, so you're not allowed, for instance, to do some kind of work in there, doing something with ropes, or let's say even making a hesped, a eulogy, a funeral inside the former synagogue. So much more so if the synagogue is standing. And similarly, one cannot put traps for animals there, or put the fruits to dry, as they used to, of course, in Israel in the heat of the summer, to dry fruits using the sun rays, and the synagogue space is not for that. Even the roof of the synagogue, even the former synagogue, and you cannot pass the synagogue just in order to make your path shorter, meaning enter from one side and then exit from the other side. It's considered I guess disrespectful for the synagogue to use it as just to shorten your way. You have to go around. Unless a person came to pray, or for some other reason that he had to be in the synagogue for the right reason, then he's allowed to exit from the other side. In fact, there are some opinions that it's even better than to exit from not from the same side as you entered. It's based on a verse in Yecheskel, but whatever the case may be, it's certainly permitted. But if a person is all he's doing is he's trying to pass the synagogue just to make it his life easier, to make his path shorter, then it's not permitted. So based on these types of things and what the Gemara says, there are all kinds of other things included. For instance, if a person needs to call someone from the synagogue, you need someone who is now sitting in the synagogue. You can just enter and say, "Hi, Chaim, come here." You have to do something in the synagogue that's at least somewhat of a mitzvah. Either say a verse from the Torah, or some Mishnah, or even just to sit down and sit a little bit in the synagogue. That's also a mitzvah. As it says, Ashrei yoshvei v'techa. How happy are those who dwell in your house, in Hashem's house, kibiyachud. So if you want to call somebody, you have to first do something in the synagogue. Other things that are forbidden in the synagogue are things like eating, drinking, certainly talking about anything that's not related to a mitzvah or to prayer or to learning Torah. So for example, if a person has some business discussion, or even just wants to ask, let's say, does the subway run today? What's the weather? Whatever he needs to discuss, he cannot do that inside the synagogue. So based on all these rules, it sounds like most people don't follow a lot of these rules, and it's very hard to avoid doing all those things. That's why a lot of synagogues today, and not just today, already for hundreds of years, a lot of synagogues, they purposefully build them in ways that might make it easier. Now, these are, of course, discussions. The practical halacha here is quite complex, and the discussions are very involved, far more than I can do on these short lessons. But at the very least, there are attempts to make at least some synagogue either on condition, what's called al-tanai, which makes some of these things permitted, or what works even better in some cases is bichlal, not to call something a synagogue. Just because people pray there doesn't mean it's a synagogue. If a rabbi wants to establish in his house a minyan, but he still wants the house to remain a house and not to have the holiness of the synagogue, he might be allowed to do that. And like I said, these issues are complex, and not everybody agrees when and how it all works. And in particular, one might ask, well, if that's the case, why not never make any synagogues, never build any synagogues? Then let's just always have everything, just private houses where we also pray, but never build anything as a synagogue. The answer is that there's a loss in this too, because there's a particular advantage of praying in a holy place. If you're just praying in someone's house just because there's a minyan, of course, it's in itself a big mitzvah to pray with a minyan, but that doesn't relate to the separate mitzvah of praying in a synagogue. There's a mitzvah to pray in a minyan, and there's a mitzvah to pray in a synagogue. So if a person is praying in a synagogue with a minyan, that's the best. He is praying with a minyan but not in a synagogue. That has the downside that it's not as the prayer is not as accepted, I guess. It's not as on the same level as the prayer in the synagogue. That's why the solution of just never making any synagogues at all and just making everything a private minyan in a private house is not always the best solution either. So it's a very tricky balance that you want to have people respect the place of prayer to the maximum extent possible, but you don't want anybody to be considered a sinner just because they talk, eat, and do all kinds of other things in the synagogue. On top of it, there are some opinions that are lenient in certain specific cases. That are these prohibitions just always? For example, you're not allowed to eat in the synagogue. Does it mean you could never ever eat in the synagogue? The Talmud itself mentions about poor people eating in the synagogue, for instance. Could it be that they ate not mamash in the synagogue, but next to the synagogue? There's a discussion in the Masechet Pesachim when kiddush is made in the synagogue. So what's the point of making kiddush if kiddush has to be in the place of eating? So it says that there are people eating there, the travelers, the poor travelers who have nowhere else to go. So it seems there are at least some situations when eating in the synagogue is permitted. Is it because it's a mitzvah, or were they eating not mamash in the synagogue, but next to the synagogue? All these things are subjects to dispute. So as I said, we should try really to our best ability to respect the synagogue and try to avoid all those things mentioned here. But many of the synagogues, at least the people who don't do that, they might have what to rely on under certain circumstances. In particular, among Hasidim, it's quite common to have a synagogue that's not really a synagogue, right? A shtibel, like just a house where a group of Hasidim also gathers to pray, but they don't want it to be to have all those strict prohibitions that are mentioned here. And if you like this video, please press like, and on the next video we'll start with Rat Hashem the laws of which Torah readings are read on which holidays and which special occasions and which haftorahs. That's the last part of this tractate.